Courtroom 7B was filled with the hushed murmurs of the audience. The air was thick with anticipation, every seat taken and eyes fixed on the case at hand. Judge Leona Grant, known for her calm demeanor and unwavering sense of justice, sat at the bench, her posture poised and professional. She had seen all sorts in her years on the bench, but she never expected this case to take such an intense turn. At the defense table sat Karen Whitfield, a woman notorious in her community for her outspoken, often abrasive behavior. She was here in court today on a charge of assault against a store employee, accused of pushing a young woman who was simply trying to enforce store policy. It wasn't Karen's first brush with controversy, but she approached the courtroom with the same entitled arrogance she was known for. Judge Grant called the session to order, her voice resonant and firm. "Ms. Whitfield, you're here today to respond to charges of assault. I trust you'll behave with respect and answer all questions truthfully." Karen barely glanced up. Her gaze was locked on her phone, scrolling through messages as if nothing happening around her was worth her attention. The courtroom grew quiet as Judge Grant's sharp gaze landed on her. "Ms. Whitfield," Judge Grant said, a hint of steel in her voice. "This is a courtroom, not your living room. I expect your full attention." Karen huffed loudly, finally looking up, and glared at the judge. "I don't even know why I'm here," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is ridiculous. I was only trying to shop in peace." Judge Grant gave her a long, hard look. "You're here because of your actions, Ms. Whitfield. If you can't handle yourself with respect, I will ask you to leave the courtroom." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. The tension in the room was palpable, and a few of the attendees exchanged uneasy glances. Karen shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing as she sized up the judge. Her face contorted into a sneer as she muttered, "Of course, I get stuck with this judge." Judge Grant's eyes flashed, but she held her composure. "If there's an issue with the court proceedings, Ms. Whitfield, please feel free to address them openly." The challenge hung in the air, and Karen's face flushed with anger. She stood up, smoothing down her expensive blouse with a smug grin on her face, and crossed her arms, staring Judge Grant down with defiance. "Look, Your Honor, you don't need to act all high and mighty here. I know who you are, and I know what you're trying to do. Trying to put me in my place, aren't you?" she sneered, a venomous smile stretching across her face. "Just because I happen to be a little better off than you." Judge Grant sat back in her chair, her gaze steady and unwavering. The room fell silent, every eye glued to the scene unfolding before them. The tension was thick as Karen's words echoed in the room, daring anyone to challenge her. But Judge Grant remained calm, her expression unreadable. "If you're done, Ms. Whitfield," Judge Grant said in a level tone, "we can proceed with the trial. This court is no place for disrespect." Karen's smug expression only grew. She glanced around the room, a mocking laugh escaping her lips. "Oh, don't act so tough," she taunted, her voice laced with condescension. "I'm not impressed by some judge with a fancy title. You think because you're up there, you have power over me?" The air in the room grew heavy, a mix of shock and disbelief swirling as Karen's taunts became more venomous. It was clear she was pushing every limit, testing every boundary she could. Judge Grant's composure was unbreakable, but those who knew her could see the fire in her eyes, the silent strength that carried her through even the most challenging cases. "Ms. Whitfield, I suggest you sit down and control yourself before you find yourself facing additional charges," Judge Grant warned, her voice quiet but deadly serious. She turned to the clerk. "Court is in recess for 10 minutes. The clerk stood, announcing the recess, and the room began to murmur with excitement and anticipation. The bailiff led Karen out of the room, who scoffed and muttered under her breath, clearly unfazed by the warnings. Judge Grant watched her go, her expression unreadable, but the people in the courtroom felt the tension lingering, a sense that something significant was about to unfold. When the court reconvened, Karen returned, her smug expression still firmly in place. Judge Grant, however, was focused and ready to continue with the proceedings. But Karen wasn't ready to back down just yet. She had a point to prove, and she wasn't about to let anyone tell her otherwise. "Ms. Whitfield," Judge Grant began, her voice steady and firm. "Do you understand the charges brought against you?" Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "Of course, I understand. I'm not an idiot," she retorted. Her tone was dripping with sarcasm, and a few gasps rippled through the audience. "This whole thing is a waste of time. I don't know why we're even bothering." Judge Grant leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "This court does not waste time, Ms. Whitfield. You are here to answer for your actions, and I suggest you take this seriously." Karen laughed, her tone mocking. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "Do you think sitting up there in your little robe makes you any better than me?" "Newsflash, Judge," she said, drawing out the title with a sneer, "you're not special. Just another person who thinks they're important." A stunned silence filled the room, everyone frozen in disbelief at the sheer audacity of Karen's words. Judge Grant's face remained impassive, but her eyes held a glint of steely resolve. "Ms. Whitfield, if you cannot control your behavior, I will hold you in contempt of court." Karen's laughter cut through the tension like a knife. "Oh, go ahead," she said, throwing her hands up in mock surrender. "I'm not scared of you. Do whatever you want." Judge Grant's patience had reached its limit. She turned to the bailiff. "Bailiff, escort Ms. Whitfield to holding until she can conduct herself appropriately. This court will not tolerate such blatant disrespect." The bailiff stepped forward, a stern look on his face, and took Karen by the arm. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty flashed in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a defiant smirk. "This isn't over," she said, glancing over her shoulder as she was led away. "You'll regret this." Judge Grant watched her go, a calm resolve settling over her. This case was far from over, but she was determined to see justice done, no matter how many obstacles stood in her way. Karen's threats echoed in her mind, but she pushed them aside, knowing that her duty was to uphold the law, regardless of personal challenges. "Hola, ¿cómo están mis amigos del TikTok? Hace tiempo que no sé ustedes. Les deseo un feliz día hermosos." Judge Grant took a deep breath, letting the silence settle over the courtroom. She had seen countless cases and a vast array of personalities, but Karen Whitfield stood out. Her refusal to show any respect or accountability was not only a defiance of the court but a blatant insult to the values Judge Grant held dear. Karen, noticing the judge's pause, leaned back in her chair, a smirk playing on her lips as if she'd already won. Her attorney, sitting beside her with a look of quiet exasperation, leaned over to whisper something to her, likely urging her to restrain herself. But Karen simply brushed him off with a flick of her wrist, her confidence unshaken. "Ms. Whitfield," Judge Grant began, her voice measured and calm. "This court is prepared to make a ruling on the charges of assault and disorderly conduct." Karen sat up straighter, her arms crossed defiantly as she stared Judge Grant down. The audience was utterly silent, every person in the room sensing that this decision held more weight than a typical ruling. Even Karen's attorney looked tense, clearly bracing for an outcome he knew wouldn't be in her favor. Judge Grant glanced at her notes, but her gaze soon lifted, focusing directly on Karen. "In reviewing the testimonies and evidence presented, it's clear that your actions were deliberate and unprovoked. This court finds you guilty of the charges brought against you." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Karen's smirk faded slightly, a flash of irritation flickering in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but Judge Grant raised a hand, stopping her. "This court isn't yet finished, Ms. Whitfield." The firm tone was enough to silence her, though the anger in her gaze was evident. Judge Grant continued, her words precise and unyielding. "Ms. Whitfield, this incident may seem minor to you, but to others, it has lasting impact. Assaulting a young employee simply for performing her duties is both unjust and inexcusable. The law is not a tool for intimidation, and it is not yours to dismiss as you see fit. Karen let out a low scoff, muttering something under her breath that the audience couldn't quite hear. The judge's calm exterior showed no reaction, but the intensity in her gaze remained unwavering. Furthermore, Judge Grant went on, "This court cannot ignore your behavior throughout these proceedings. Disrespecting the court and those within it demonstrates a lack of understanding of the consequences of your actions." The courtroom remained tense, with every person riveted by the unfolding events. Karen shifted in her seat, her smirk now gone as a cold expression settled on her face. Judge Grant took a moment before delivering the sentence. "Ms. Whitfield, I hereby sentence you to a period of community service, where you will work directly with individuals in public service. You are also ordered to complete an anger management program and attend sensitivity training to better understand the impact of your actions." Karen's mouth dropped open, and she shook her head in disbelief. "Community service," she spat, the words laced with disdain. "I'm not some criminal who needs to pick up trash on the side of the road." "Perhaps not," Judge Grant replied evenly, "but you are an individual who needs to understand the effects of her behavior on those around her." Karen's anger grew, her hands clenched into fists as she shot the judge a scathing look. "This is ridiculous. You're punishing me for standing up for myself. This isn't justice, this is your personal vendetta." Judge Grant's expression remained unchanged, and she held Karen's gaze with quiet strength. "You're mistaken, Ms. Whitfield. This is justice. You will serve your sentence as ordered, and I will expect documentation of your completion within the next 6 months. Failure to comply will result in further legal action." A wave of quiet murmurs swept through the audience as the judge's ruling became clear. Karen's defiant expression faltered for a brief moment, but her anger quickly returned. She turned to her attorney, gesturing wildly, but he simply shook his head, signaling that there was nothing he could do. The judge's decision was final. The bailiff stepped forward, ready to escort Karen out of the courtroom. She stood, glaring at Judge Grant with a venomous intensity, her body tense with rage. But Judge Grant merely watched her, calm and composed, embodying the very dignity that Karen had refused to show. "This isn't over," Karen hissed, her voice barely audible but filled with venom. She allowed herself to be led out of the courtroom, though her gaze never left the judge, her expression promising retribution. As the doors closed behind her, the tension in the room dissipated, leaving behind an atmosphere of relief and satisfaction. The audience began to file out, murmuring amongst themselves about the outcome. Sophia, the young store clerk, let out a small sigh of relief, visibly relieved to see justice served. Judge Grant watched the courtroom empty, her mind focused on the broader impact of the case. Once the room was clear, she took a moment to reflect, her gaze distant as she thought over the events of the day. She had seen her fair share of cases, but few left an impression quite like this one. Karen Whitfield was a force of entitlement and privilege, someone who believed herself immune to consequences. But Judge Grant knew that the law was the great equalizer, a reminder that everyone was accountable for their actions. However, what Judge Grant didn't know was that Karen was far from finished. In her mind, the verdict was not an end but an opening, a reason to push back harder, to retaliate in a way that would leave a lasting impact. A few days later, Karen, still furious and unwilling to accept the judge's ruling, decided to take matters into her own hands. She contacted a few influential friends, people with enough connections and power to disrupt even a judge's life. She vented her frustrations to them, spinning the story to paint herself as the victim of a biased system, a system that had failed her by siding with a power-hungry judge. Her friends, sympathetic and eager to support her, advised her to file a formal complaint against Judge Grant. They suggested she highlight improper conduct and claim that the judge had shown personal bias against her. Karen's mind raced as she plotted her next move, her anger fueling her desire to bring the judge down. As Karen filed her complaint, she made sure to leverage every connection she had, from local officials to influential business partners. She wanted to shake Judge Grant's world, to make her regret ever crossing paths with her. Karen was relentless, pulling every string, contacting every person she could think of who might have the slightest influence over the judicial system. Her goal was simple: she wanted to see Judge Grant's career crumble. Judge Grant was informed of the complaint a few weeks later, receiving a notice that her conduct was under review. While she was confident in her integrity, she understood that this was no small matter. The court's review process was strict, and even the slightest allegation could tarnish a judge's reputation. But she knew that her decisions had been sound, and she trusted in the justice system to reveal the truth. In the meantime, Karen's community service began. She was assigned to a public community center, where she would assist in basic tasks and work with people from diverse backgrounds. The experience was far from glamorous, and she despised every minute of it. But her disdain for the service only strengthened her resolve to get back at Judge Grant, to prove that no one could impose consequences on her and get away with it. Karen's frustration simmered as she went through the motions of her community service. Every morning, she was required to report to the community center at 8 a.m., where she'd help with various tasks, from organizing supply shelves to assisting with meal preparation for low-income families. The center was bustling with activity and volunteers from all walks of life, people who were genuinely passionate about serving their community. But Karen felt as though she was above it all, resentful that she'd been forced into a situation she considered beneath her. One morning, as Karen was stacking supplies in the pantry, she overheard two volunteers talking about Judge Grant. Her ears perked up, recognizing the judge's name immediately. The two women, seemingly unaware of Karen's connection to the judge, were praising her work in the community. "I just love how fair Judge Grant is," one of them said, smiling as she adjusted the cans on a lower shelf. "She doesn't just rule from her bench, she's out there every month, volunteering her time and connecting with people in the community." The other woman nodded, her face lighting up. "Exactly. She's actually coming by next week for our community outreach event. It's so refreshing to see someone in her position who really cares." Karen's face contorted with disdain. Of course, she thought bitterly, Judge Grant is trying to play the saint. It sickened her to hear these women talk about the judge as though she were some kind of hero. Karen was determined to show them otherwise. Later that week, as her community service continued, Karen began to plot how she could use this upcoming outreach event to her advantage. She reached out to one of her influential friends, hoping to arrange for some media attention to be at the event. She wanted the world to see Judge Grant outside the courtroom, hoping that if she caused enough of a scene, it might sway public opinion against the judge. Meanwhile, Judge Grant remained steadfast in her work, unaware of Karen's plans. The judge's life was busy as always, with back-to-back cases and preparations for the upcoming outreach event. She looked forward to spending time with community members, a grounding experience that reminded her why she had chosen to pursue justice in the first place. The day of the event arrived, and the community center was buzzing with excitement. People from all over the city gathered, many of them familiar faces who had benefited from the center's support programs. Judge Grant was warmly welcomed by the staff and volunteers, who were eager to show her the progress they had made in the past few months. Karen, however, was lurking nearby, waiting for her moment. She had managed to arrange for a local news outlet to be present, ensuring that cameras would be rolling when she confronted the judge. She had carefully rehearsed her lines, planning to accuse Judge Grant of abusing her power, manipulating the court system, and being biased in her rulings. At midday, Judge Grant was mingling with community members, speaking with a group of young adults about the importance of civic engagement. Karen spotted her, seething as she watched the judge laugh and chat as though she were some kind of hero. Fueled by her anger, Karen marched over, catching the attention of a few nearby attendees. "Judge Grant," Karen called out, her voice loud and commanding enough to draw a small crowd. The judge turned, a look of surprise crossing her face as she recognized Karen. "Ms. Whitfield," Judge Grant replied, maintaining a composed expression. "I didn't expect to see you here." Karen sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "Oh, I'm sure you didn't. It must be nice to come here and pretend like you care about people. But we both know the truth, don't we?" The surrounding attendees exchanged confused glances, unsure of what was happening. Some of them, noticing Karen's hostile tone, began inching closer, curiosity piqued. "Ms. Whitfield," Judge Grant said evenly, "if you have something you'd like to discuss, I suggest we do so privately." Karen shook her head, raising her voice. "No, everyone here deserves to hear this. You parade around like you're some saint, but you're just another corrupt judge hiding behind a title." The crowd murmured, some people looking at Judge Grant with a mixture of surprise and concern. A couple of reporters stepped forward, cameras now focused on Karen's outburst, eager to capture whatever drama might unfold. "Ms. Whitfield," Judge Grant replied, her tone calm but firm, "this is neither the time nor the place for such accusations. I suggest you reconsider your approach." But Karen wasn't finished. "You think you can just brush me off?" she demanded, stepping closer. "You humiliated me in court, forced me into this ridiculous community service, and for what? So you can feel good about yourself?" Judge Grant's expression didn't waver, but her eyes showed a flicker of sadness. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Ms. Whitfield, the sentence I issued was a reflection of the law and the evidence presented. It was not personal." Karen scoffed, throwing her hands up dramatically. "Not personal," she repeated, her voice incredulous. "You targeted me because I dared to stand up for myself. Well, I'm standing up for myself again, and I won't let you hide behind your bench." The crowd had grown larger, with people now murmuring among themselves, some clearly uncomfortable with the tension while others watched with interest. The reporters captured every word, their cameras recording each reaction. One of the reporters stepped forward, microphone extended. "Judge Grant, would you like to respond to these accusations?" she asked, her tone cautious. Judge Grant held her gaze steady, addressing the crowd. "I understand that Ms. Whitfield is upset, and she has the right to express her feelings. However, this is neither the time nor place for such a discussion. If anyone has concerns regarding my conduct, I encourage them to follow the appropriate channels." Karen's anger only intensified at Judge Grant's poised response. She could feel the crowd's sympathy slipping away, and she wasn't about to let that happen. "You can act all high and mighty here, but you can't fool everyone," she spat, her voice shaking with frustration. "People like you, people in power, you think you're untouchable, but you're not." Judge Grant's gaze softened, her expression one of calm resolve. "Ms. Whitfield, I respect your right to speak, but I ask that we handle this conversation in a way that's respectful to everyone here." Karen's response was a contemptuous scoff, her eyes narrowing as she glared at the judge. The confrontation had lost some of its initial energy, and the crowd was beginning to disperse, disinterested in the drama that Karen had hoped would unfold. One of the community center's staff members approached, offering to escort Karen out, but she pushed them away, storming out on her own. Her plan to humiliate Judge Grant had backfired spectacularly, and now she was left fuming, angrier than ever. As she walked away, the weight of her failed confrontation settled on her, but she refused to let go of her grudge. In her mind, Judge Grant was still to blame for her public embarrassment, and she was determined to find a way to make her pay. The thought of going through her community service sentence filled her with dread, but Karen knew that she would have to endure it if she wanted any chance of revenge. Back in the community center, Judge Grant resumed her conversations with the attendees, maintaining her composure despite the public confrontation. She knew that Karen's anger stemmed from deeper issues, but her duty as a judge was to uphold the law, even if it meant facing the resentment of those she sentenced. As she spoke with the volunteers and community members, Judge Grant felt a renewed sense of purpose, determined to continue her work with integrity and resilience. Karen's frustration only grew as she continued her mandatory community service. Each day felt like a fresh insult as she was assigned to assist different people from the community, performing tasks she deemed menial. Yet, despite her seething resentment, she noticed something unsettling: the warmth and gratitude shown by the people around her. They treated her kindly, offering her coffee or snacks and even making friendly small talk. To Karen, this felt like salt on the wound, a stark contrast to the entitlement and respect she was accustomed to demanding from others. One afternoon, Karen was assigned to a particularly busy shift at the center, helping prepare meals for a group of families struggling with food insecurity. Her supervisor for the day was a kind, soft-spoken woman named Eleanor, who took the time to explain each task to Karen and patiently answered her questions. Eleanor was well known at the center, beloved for her generosity and her commitment to helping others. As they worked together, Eleanor tried to engage Karen in conversation, sensing her reluctance. "This kind of work can be really fulfilling," she said, glancing at Karen with a warm smile. "Knowing we're making a difference in someone's day, it's something I look forward to." Karen rolled her eyes, barely managing to hide her irritation. "I don't need to make a difference," she muttered, her voice dripping with disdain. "I don't see how doing this helps anyone in the long run." Eleanor chuckled softly, undeterred by Karen's dismissive tone. "Sometimes, just a hot meal can mean everything to someone going through a hard time. You'd be surprised how much small gestures of kindness can mean to people." Karen shook her head, unwilling to be convinced. She didn't want to be there, and every moment felt like another reminder of her court-mandated punishment. Yet, as she watched Eleanor interact with the families coming through, warmly greeting each person and asking after their well-being, she couldn't deny the genuine connection between Eleanor and the community members. They appreciated her kindness, and for a fleeting moment, Karen felt a pang of something she couldn't quite place, a mix of envy and discomfort. The day wore on, and Karen grew increasingly irritable as more families arrived, each one receiving warm meals and encouragement from Eleanor and the other volunteers. Karen grumbled as she handed out plates, feeling the sting of her own resentment intensify. These were people she wouldn't typically cross paths with, and the empathy and camaraderie on display only served to remind her of how isolated she'd become in her self-centered world. As she left the center that evening, Karen's mood had soured further. She was exhausted, not just from the physical work but from the emotional drain of watching people treat each other with a kindness she rarely experienced. She returned home that evening in a foul mood, slamming her keys onto the counter and vowing that she'd find a way out of this ridiculous sentence. Meanwhile, Judge Grant's professional life had been quietly shaken by the complaint Karen had filed. She had faced scrutiny before, but Karen's accusations were severe, alleging bias and misconduct. Despite her steadfast commitment to integrity, Judge Grant was required to undergo a formal review. She cooperated fully, knowing that transparency was essential to maintaining the public's trust in the justice system. Still, the process was stressful and invasive, and it took a toll on her. One evening, Judge Grant was at home, reviewing case files, when she received a call from a colleague, Judge Ramirez, who had been following the situation closely. "You're handling this with incredible grace, Victoria," he said, his tone one of reassurance. "But be careful. People like Karen Whitfield are relentless. She's out to destroy your reputation because you didn't let her get away with her actions." Judge Grant sighed, the weight of the situation settling over her. "I know," she replied softly. "I can't let her intimidate me, but it's hard to ignore the impact this could have on my career." "You've done everything by the book," Judge Ramirez reminded her. "People know your integrity. Karen may stir up some noise, but those who know you know the truth." Judge Grant appreciated his words but couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's vendetta was far from over. She resolved to stay focused on her duties, determined not to let Karen's actions undermine her commitment to the justice system. A few days later, the community center held another outreach event, this time a fundraiser to support local families in need. Judge Grant attended as a special guest, honored to be part of the occasion. She spent time speaking with attendees and sharing her insights on the importance of supporting underprivileged communities. Her warmth and genuine interest left a lasting impression on those around her, reinforcing the respect and admiration she'd earned over her career. Karen, however, had learned of the event and saw it as yet another opportunity to confront Judge Grant. With her resentment fueling her actions, Karen arrived at the fundraiser, once again hoping to catch the judge off guard. She approached quietly, waiting for the right moment to make her presence known. As Judge Grant finished her speech, Karen stepped forward, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "Well, well, well," she called out, drawing the crowd's attention. Judge Grant, here to play the role of the noble leader once again. The crowd's attention shifted to Karen, recognizing her from the previous outburst. Many looked on with curiosity, while some exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain about what might unfold. Judge Grant turned to face Karen, her expression calm but alert. "Ms. Whitfield," she said, her voice steady. "This event is meant to support the community. I'm asking you to respect the efforts of those here." Karen laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the crowd's silence. "Respect?" she scoffed. "That's rich coming from someone who humiliated me in court and then forced me into this ridiculous sentence." Judge Grant maintained her composure, addressing both Karen and the crowd. "Ms. Whitfield, I issued a fair sentence based on the evidence. This isn't personal, it's about accountability." Karen's expression darkened, her anger bubbling over as she glared at the judge. "You're just using your position to act high and mighty," she snapped. "You think community service is going to change anything? It's a waste of my time and my life." Before Judge Grant could respond, Eleanor stepped forward from the crowd, her gentle presence a calming contrast to Karen's rage. "Ms. Whitfield," she said softly, her voice steady. "I know this experience may not feel meaningful to you, but it's had a real impact on the people here. Your efforts, however begrudging, have helped others." Karen bristled, taken aback by Eleanor's calm demeanor. She had expected Judge Grant to respond, not this unassuming volunteer. "I don't care," Karen spat. "I'm not here to be anyone's savior. I'm here because I was forced." Eleanor met Karen's gaze, her expression sympathetic yet unwavering. "Sometimes, Ms. Whitfield, the value of our actions isn't in what they mean to us, but in what they mean to others. I understand that you're angry, but perhaps there's something you could learn from this experience." Karen's face contorted in disbelief, unable to comprehend how someone could speak so earnestly to her. She had spent her life using her influence and power to bend others to her will, and the idea of learning anything from this experience was an insult in her eyes. The crowd looked on in silence, watching the exchange with a mixture of empathy and discomfort. Judge Grant observed the scene thoughtfully, aware that Karen's anger ran deep and was rooted in more than just the court sentence. Despite everything, she hoped that one day, Karen might find a way to change, even if it was beyond her influence. Karen stormed off, her emotions roiling as she left the fundraiser. Her outburst had once again failed to yield the results she desired. Instead of bringing shame to Judge Grant, she had only alienated herself further from those around her. Days after the fundraiser, Karen's frustration reached a boiling point. Every attempt to tarnish Judge Grant's image had backfired, leaving her more isolated and humiliated than before. The judge's calm responses and the community's unwavering support only fueled Karen's anger, and the realization that her influence was slipping drove her nearly to despair. Determined to regain some control, Karen devised a new plan. This time, she would try a different approach, one that would put Judge Grant on edge without the public spotlight. Karen decided to wait outside the courthouse, planning to confront Judge Grant in private, away from the support of the community or her professional allies. She believed that, without the formality of a courtroom or a crowd to impress, the judge might reveal the weaknesses Karen was sure lay beneath her composed exterior. That afternoon, Judge Grant exited the courthouse, her focus on her phone as she scanned through emails from the day. She walked briskly toward her car, her mind on the work still waiting for her at home. Just as she was unlocking her car, Karen stepped out of the shadows, positioning herself directly in the judge's path. "Judge Grant," Karen said, her voice low but filled with barely controlled rage. Judge Grant looked up, her expression momentarily surprised but quickly settling into one of calm resolve. "Ms. Whitfield," she replied. "Is there something I can help you with?" Karen scoffed, crossing her arms as she glared at the judge. "Help me?" she sneered. "You're the last person I'd ever ask for help." Judge Grant held her gaze, unfazed. "Then what is it you want, Ms. Whitfield?" Karen took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "I want you to understand just how much damage you've done to me. You've ruined my reputation, forced me into humiliating situations, and turned my life upside down. All because you think you're some kind of saint." Judge Grant's expression softened slightly, though she remained poised. "Ms. Whitfield, the consequences you're facing are a result of your own actions. My role as a judge is to uphold the law, not to tear people down." Karen's jaw clenched, her frustration evident as she struggled to find the words to convey her anger. "You don't get it, do you?" she snapped. "People like me, people with power and influence, we're supposed to be respected. You've undermined everything I've built." Judge Grant regarded her carefully, choosing her words with care. "Respect is something earned, Ms. Whitfield. Power alone doesn't bring respect. Your actions in the community have shown people a side of you they might not have seen otherwise." Karen shook her head, unable to process the judge's response. In her mind, power and respect were inextricably linked, and the idea of earning respect through kindness or humility was foreign to her. She had spent years cultivating an image of authority, and Judge Grant's actions had threatened to dismantle it piece by piece. "You think you know me?" Karen spat, her voice rising. "You think you can just wave your little gavel and make decisions about who I am?" Judge Grant held her gaze, her expression unyielding. "My decisions are based on the evidence, not personal feelings. It's my duty to ensure that justice is served impartially, regardless of who stands before me." Karen's anger boiled over, her voice filled with a bitter edge. "Justice? You don't know the first thing about justice. You're just hiding behind your title, pretending to be something you're not." The judge's eyes reflected a quiet strength as she regarded Karen. "I'm aware that my position comes with a responsibility, Ms. Whitfield, one that I take very seriously. And that responsibility includes holding people accountable for their actions, no matter their status or wealth." Karen's eyes blazed with anger, her fists clenched at her sides. "You may think you've won," she hissed. "But I'm not done yet. I'll make sure everyone sees you for who you really are." Judge Grant's calm demeanor didn't waver. She nodded, her gaze steady as she met Karen's glare. "If you believe there's a path to justice, Ms. Whitfield, then I won't stand in your way. But I won't compromise my principles to appease anyone, no matter their status." Karen's face twisted with frustration, her mind racing as she tried to process the judge's unwavering response. She had hoped to unsettle Judge Grant, to make her feel the fear and insecurity Karen felt every time she was forced into a vulnerable position. But instead, the judge's calm strength only made Karen feel more powerless, her attempts to rattle the judge having failed yet again. Fuming, Karen turned on her heel, storming off into the night with a renewed determination to find a way to hurt Judge Grant. She refused to let go of the grudge she had nursed for so long, convinced that the judge's downfall was the only way to restore her pride. As Karen walked away, Judge Grant stood by her car, watching her retreat with a mixture of sadness and resolve. She knew that Karen's anger was a reflection of her own internal struggles, and while she couldn't change Karen's heart, she hoped that one day, Karen might find a way to move beyond her resentment. Over the next few weeks, Karen's resentment continued to fester. She threw herself into her community service, using every moment as an opportunity to gather information that she believed could be used against Judge Grant. She spoke with volunteers, asking questions about the judge's past involvement with the center, hoping to uncover something, anything, that could tarnish her reputation. But to Karen's frustration, every story she heard only painted the judge in a positive light. People praised Judge Grant for her generosity, her dedication, and her willingness to support those in need. The more Karen learned, the more isolated she felt, realizing that her attempts to gather ammunition against the judge were only reinforcing the community's respect for her. Then one evening, as Karen was sorting supplies in the center's pantry, she overheard a group of volunteers discussing an upcoming event, a mentorship program for young adults in the community. Karen's ears perked up as she listened, realizing that the program was one of Judge Grant's personal projects. Determined to disrupt the event, Karen began formulating a plan, intent on finding a way to discredit the judge in front of the very people she had worked so hard to support. On the night of the mentorship event, Karen arrived early, positioning herself near the entrance where she could observe the attendees as they arrived. She had crafted a story, a narrative she planned to share with anyone who would listen, hoping to plant seeds of doubt in their minds about the judge's character. She watched as Judge Grant arrived, warmly greeting the young people who had gathered for the mentorship program. Karen's opportunity came when a small group of attendees gathered nearby, chatting with one another as they waited for the event to begin. She approached them, her tone casual but laced with underlying contempt. "So, you're all here for Judge Grant's little program, huh?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The young adults exchanged glances, a few nodding in response. "Yeah," one of them replied, "she's been amazing. It's really inspiring to see someone in her position giving back to the community." Karen laughed, a harsh sound that drew curious glances from the group. "Oh, I'm sure she's got you all fooled," she sneered. "You think she cares about you? She's just using this as a way to boost her own image. People like her don't actually care about anyone but themselves." The young people looked taken aback, some frowning as they tried to process Karen's words. One of them spoke up, her voice tentative. "But, she's been volunteering here for years. She doesn't have to do any of this, but she chooses to." Karen rolled her eyes, dismissing the comment. "Of course she does. It's all about appearances. Trust me, I know people like her. They pretend to care, but it's all for show." Just then, Judge Grant walked over, noticing the group gathered around Karen. She sensed the tension in the air, her expression shifting to one of concern as she addressed the young adults. "Is everything all right here?" The group turned to her, some nodding while others glanced at Karen with uncertain expressions. Karen took the opportunity to step forward, her eyes locked onto the judge with a smug look. "Just telling them the truth about you, Judge Grant. They deserve to know who they're really dealing with." Judge Grant met her gaze calmly, her voice gentle but firm. "Ms. Whitfield, these young people came here tonight to learn and grow. I ask that you respect their experience and allow them the space to form their own impressions." Karen scoffed, crossing her arms defiantly. "Respect? That's the one thing you've never shown me, Judge Grant." Judge Grant took a steadying breath, her gaze unwavering as she responded, "Respect is earned, Ms. Whitfield. And I have always treated you with the respect that the court system affords to everyone." The young adults looked on, their admiration for Judge Grant only growing as they watched her handle the confrontation with dignity and grace. Karen, sensing the shift in their perception, felt the sting of defeat yet again, her plan unraveling before her eyes. Karen's resentment had reached its peak after her failed attempt to sway the mentorship group. Each day of community service only deepened her anger, the judge's calm responses playing on a loop in her mind. She convinced herself that Judge Grant was hiding behind a facade, and Karen's single-minded determination to expose her intensified. As her mandatory hours neared completion, she vowed to make one final, dramatic stand against the judge, something that would shake the foundation of her esteemed reputation. Karen's plan took form as she plotted to attend Judge Grant's next court hearing, a case of local significance with plenty of public attention. She intended to disrupt it publicly, leveraging the high-profile setting to make accusations that would cast doubt on the judge's integrity and fairness. The day of the hearing arrived, and Karen, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, walked into the courthouse with a determined expression. She took a seat in the back, watching as the proceedings began. Judge Grant entered the courtroom, her presence composed and dignified as always. Karen waited until the courtroom was full, with reporters and local figures taking notes. Just as the opening statements began, Karen stood abruptly, her voice cutting through the room as she shouted, "Judge Grant, you're nothing but a fraud. This courtroom deserves the truth." The entire room fell silent, shocked at the sudden outburst. Judge Grant looked up, momentarily taken aback, but quickly regained her composure. Her gaze settled on Karen, a mixture of patience and resolve in her expression. "Ms. Whitfield," Judge Grant said firmly, "this is a court of law, and your behavior is highly inappropriate. I ask you to respect these proceedings and take your seat." Karen, unfazed, continued, "I'm not here to respect a sham of a court run by someone hiding behind their title." Her voice rose, her words laced with contempt as she accused Judge Grant of using her power for personal gain and bending the law to suit her own interests. The audience looked on, some shocked, others murmuring among themselves. A few reporters jotted down notes, intrigued by the unexpected drama. Judge Grant raised a hand, her voice calm but firm as she addressed Karen. "Ms. Whitfield, this is not the place for personal grievances. Please take your seat, or I will have no choice but to ask security to escort you out." Karen ignored the warning, her face contorted in anger as she launched into a tirade, accusing Judge Grant of corruption, bias, and manipulation. "This so-called judge," she sneered, gesturing at Judge Grant, "is nothing but a hypocrite. She's here to serve herself, not the community." At that moment, the bailiff approached, gently placing a hand on Karen's arm to lead her out. But Karen pulled away, escalating her accusations as the entire courtroom watched in stunned silence. As she continued, her words grew more venomous, painting a picture of the judge that bore no resemblance to reality but captured the attention of everyone present. Judge Grant maintained her calm, her voice unwavering as she ordered the bailiff to escort Karen out. "Ms. Whitfield, this is your final warning. I urge you to leave peacefully, as any further disruption will be treated as contempt of court." Reluctantly, Karen was led out, her voice still echoing through the hall as she continued to hurl accusations. The courtroom settled back into silence, a lingering tension in the air as Judge Grant resumed the hearing, unshaken by Karen's disruption. The session continued without further incident, but the impact of Karen's outburst left a lasting impression. News of the incident quickly spread, with local papers covering the outburst and Karen's accusations. But as reporters dug deeper, they found no evidence to support her claims. Instead, interviews with community members, colleagues, and even former defendants portrayed Judge Grant as a pillar of integrity and fairness, one whose record remained unblemished. In the following days, Karen's story began to unravel. The community, already skeptical of her, now saw her as someone who had tried to manipulate the system for personal vendetta. Her friends distanced themselves, and she found herself increasingly isolated as people grew wary of her intentions. Meanwhile, Judge Grant continued her work, undeterred by Karen's attempt to tarnish her reputation. She remained focused on serving her community, her calm resolve a stark contrast to Karen's bitterness. Judge Grant's compassion and fairness only grew in the eyes of those she served, her integrity shining even brighter in the face of Karen's hostility. Months passed, and Karen's life took a downward spiral. The consequences of her actions became evident as she faced social isolation and professional setbacks. Her reputation, once defined by influence and power, was now marred by her own bitterness. The very thing she had tried to protect, her image, had crumbled, leaving her to confront the emptiness her actions had created. As the reality of her choices set in, Karen found herself reflecting on Judge Grant's words, the advice she had so readily dismissed. She began to realize that respect was indeed something earned, not something she could command through intimidation or power. It was a bitter lesson, one she wished she had understood sooner. Judge Grant, however, continued to lead with the dignity and strength that had defined her career. Her reputation only grew, her character unwavering in the face of adversity. Her legacy was one of resilience, compassion, and justice, a reminder that true power lay not in dominance but in the quiet strength to do what was right. Karen's story faded from the public eye, a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked pride and resentment. Judge Grant's legacy, however, endured, a testament to the power of integrity and the strength that comes from facing adversity with grace.